Greenville, South Carolina, seemed like one of those towns straight out of a movie, where life was simple, neighbors were friendly, and children grew up playing in the streets. With a population of just over 60,000 inhabitants, everyone knew everyone by sight, and it was rare for something truly shocking to happen there. People were proud to live in a safe place, far from the great tragedies that seemed to affect the rest of the country. But sometimes danger isn't lurking in dark corners or coming from outside. Sometimes it is born from secrets kept behind closed doors. Sarah Thompson was one of those girls that many parents would consider a perfect girl. At 18, about to graduate from high school, she was popular at school and had a cheerful presence that brightened up any room. She was always involved in extracurricular activities, whether leading the cheer team or participating in volunteer projects in the community. Anyone looking from the outside would never suspect that behind her bright smiles, Sarah carried a dark secret. The name of this secret? Robert Mitchell. Robert was the typical charismatic history teacher who all the students respected and, in a way, admired. At 42 years old, married and father of 2 young children, he seemed to be an example of a family man. He had an engaging way of teaching, which made students interested in even the most monotonous subjects. However, the connection between him and Sarah went beyond the classroom. It all started innocently. Sarah needed extra help with a history project, and Robert offered to mentor her. Study sessions became more frequent, and as time went by, the teacher-student barrier began to break down. What was supposed to be a simple tutoring evolved into more intimate conversations, and soon the two started meeting outside the school, in cafes far from the city, where no one would recognize them. Sarah was confused about what she felt. On the one hand, I knew the relationship was wrong. She knew that Robert was married, that this could ruin his life and hers too. But at the same time, there was something exciting about it all. The adrenaline of keeping the secret, the attention she received from someone older, the way Robert made her feel special. All of this fueled her desire to continue with it, despite the risks. Meanwhile, at home, things began to change. Sarah's father, David Thompson, noticed that his daughter was different. She was no longer that happy and open girl who shared everything with him. David was always very protective of Sarah, especially after his wife, Sarah's mother, passed away in a car accident 3 years earlier. He had taken care of Sarah pretty much alone ever since, and his instinct as a father told him something was wrong. Sarah started coming home late, making up lame excuses about schoolwork, or meeting up with friends that David knew didn't make sense. Family dinners became silent, with Sarah distracted and David trying unsuccessfully to connect with her. He tried to confront her several times, but whenever he asked her about what was going on, Sarah clammed up and avoided the subject. She seemed to be living in 2 parallel worlds, torn between her obedient daughter and her secret lover. The tension inside the Thompson household was rising, but David still had no idea what was really going on. His distrust, however, grew every day, and he knew that he would eventually discover the truth. Meanwhile, Robert, on the other side, was trying to keep up appearances at home with his wife and children, but he was also increasingly emotionally involved with Sarah. He knew he was playing with fire, but somehow, he couldn't stop. The messages between the two became more frequent and full of innuendo, planning secret meetings and exchanging personal confessions. The risk of being discovered was real, but both seemed to be blinded by the emotion of the moment. It was only a matter of time before everything came to light, until that secret, kept so carefully, was exposed to the light of day. The quiet town of Greenville, which until then seemed immune to scandals and tragedies, was about to witness an event that would mark its history forever. The clock was already ticking, the silence about to be broken. The tension in the Thompson household only increased. David Thompson could no longer ignore his daughter Sarah's strange behavior. Something was deeply wrong, and he knew it wasn't just end-of-school stress or graduation anxiety. It was something bigger. His parental intuition was screaming, and David wasn't the type to ignore his instincts. On the evening of March 22, 2017, David finally decided he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to know what was going on. Sarah was taking a shower, and her cell phone, left on the bed, vibrated with a notification. David, acting on impulse, picked up the device. He hesitated for a moment. He knew that invading his daughter's privacy was wrong, but his concern outweighed any moral hesitation. With his heart beating fast, he unlocked his phone and started reading the messages. What he found was a shock. The name that came up repeatedly in conversations was not a classmate's, but rather Robert Mitchell, Sarah's history teacher. The messages revealed a much more intimate relationship than any interaction between student and teacher should be. Sarah and Robert talked about hidden encounters, exchanging compliments that left no doubt about the nature of what was happening between them. David felt like he had been punched in the stomach. His 18-year-old daughter was involved with a married man, 24 years his senior, someone he trusted. The words on the screen seemed to scramble in his mind as the reality of the situation set in. Anger, betrayal, sadness, everything mixed inside him. He stood still for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to process what he had just discovered. He thought about confronting Sarah immediately, but he knew he needed to act calmly, or at least as calmly as he could be in a situation like that. I didn't want to do something that could make the situation worse, although I wasn't sure how it could get worse. Upon hearing the shower turning off, David quickly put his cell phone back where it was and left the room, trying to appear normal. But inside, he was devastated. The relationship between Sarah and Robert was not only a betrayal of his trust, but something he saw as a threat to his daughter's integrity and future. He couldn't let this go, not without consequences. The next day, David woke up with only one thought on his mind: confronting Robert. He couldn't let that situation continue. What that man was doing was wrong on so many levels. He decided the best way to deal with this was to talk to Robert directly, but away from Sarah and the school. He didn't want his daughter to know his intentions until he resolved the issue. That afternoon, David went to school, waiting in the parking lot until Robert finished his classes. When Robert left school, he didn't expect to find David there, much less with a serious and determined expression on his face. The professor tried to maintain his composure, but when he saw David marching towards him, he knew something was wrong. "We need to talk," David said, his words razor sharp. Robert tried to remain calm, but his nervousness was evident. He couldn't escape the situation, and now he was face to face with Sarah's father. The silence between the two was heavy as they moved away to a more private area of the parking lot, away from the eyes of the other teachers and students. David didn't waste time beating around the bush. "I know what you're doing to my daughter," he said, his voice low but full of anger. "You are married, you have children. How could you get involved with an 18-year-old girl?" Robert tried to argue, saying that the situation was more complicated than it seemed, that the feelings had developed unexpectedly, and that he never wanted to hurt anyone. But to David, these were nothing more than weak excuses. In the eyes of a parent, there was no justification that could explain what was happening. "If you think you can keep this up, you're sorely mistaken," David threatened, his voice getting louder. "If you don't end this now, I'll expose everything. I'll tell your wife, the school administration, the police. I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are." Robert, trying to remain calm, replied, "David, I understand how this sounds, but I care about your daughter. I never wanted to hurt anyone." David didn't want to hear anymore. He stepped forward, looking Robert straight in the eye, and said, "I'm not asking. I'm warning you. Get it over with. Today, or you will pay the price." The threat remained in the air for a few seconds. Robert, feeling the weight of David's words, shook his head silently, acknowledging that he had no choice. He knew that if this continued, his life would be ruined in every way possible. David walked away, leaving Robert alone in the parking lot, processing what had just happened. The professor knew he needed to end the relationship with Sarah, but the emotional dilemma he felt paralyzed him. Sarah, in turn, was still oblivious to the approaching storm, believing that her secret was safe. Little did she know that, at that exact moment, her father had thrown the first stone that would trigger a series of tragic and irreversible events. What began as a simple investigation by a concerned father was about to collapse into a tragedy that no one could have predicted. 2 days after the parking lot confrontation, the tension between Robert and Sarah was palpable. Robert hadn't slept well since his conversation with David. He knew he needed to end the relationship, but he couldn't find the words or the right time to do so. Every time he thought about breaking up, he felt the weight of what would come next. the disappointment in Sarah's eyes, the possible collapse of his own family life, the scandal that would ensue if David made good on his threat. On the afternoon of March 24, 2017, Robert finally made a decision. He needed to end this once and for all. He knew that prolonging the inevitable would only make things worse, so he arranged a meeting with Sarah, claiming that they needed to talk. They met in a park away from the city, a place they had used in their previous encounters, where they could hide from suspicion and prying eyes. When Sarah arrived, her face lit up when she saw Robert. She ran up to him, smiling, with no idea what was about to happen. Robert tried to force a smile in response, but the gravity of the situation was written all over his face. He hugged her, a gesture that seemed more like a goodbye than a greeting, but Sarah didn't notice. "What happened?" she asked, with a carefree tone of voice. "You seemed tense in the last few messages." Robert hesitated, looking away for a moment, before finally looking at Sarah. "We need to talk, Sarah. And it's not an easy conversation," he said, his voice thick with tension. Sarah frowned, the joy on her face giving way to concern. "What is happening?" she asked, now more cautious. Robert took a deep breath. He couldn't help the lump in his throat that formed as he tried to find the right words. "This," he began, pausing to organize his thoughts. "This between us, it can't continue." Sarah froze. That wasn't what she expected to hear. Suddenly, everything she thought she had under control began to crumble around her. "What are you saying, Robert?" she asked, her voice lower, almost a whisper. "David, your father, he knows. He confronted me," Robert revealed, his words coming out quickly. "He gave me an ultimatum. If I don't put an end to this, he's going to tell my wife, the school, everyone." Sarah brought her hand to her mouth, her heart racing. The idea that her father knew everything terrified her. She was always afraid of what would happen if the secret was discovered, but she never imagined that her own father could be the cause of the destruction of everything she and Robert had built. "No," she exclaimed, her words filled with panic. "We can solve this. Can we? Can we run away? I don't know. But we can't just end it." Robert shook his head. "Sarah, this has gone too far. I can't go on with this. I love my family, and if this continues, I will lose everything." Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of tears. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She felt betrayed, as if everything they had was disposable. She thought about fighting harder, about arguing, but despair overcame her. There weren't enough words to change what was happening. The cruel reality that everything was about to end hit her like a blow. "What about me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What am I to you, Robert?" Robert felt the impact of the question. He wanted to say that he cared about her, that she meant something to him. But he knew that anything he said at that moment would only prolong their suffering. "I care about you, Sarah, in truth. But this should never have happened. I'm very sorry." Sarah stood still, unresponsive, as tears ran down her face. She felt helpless, lost. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of something she believed was special, something she had sacrificed so much to keep secret. Now, everything seemed to have been in vain. Robert stepped forward, trying to comfort her, but she moved away. "Don't touch me," she screamed, full of pain and anger. Robert stopped, feeling the weight of his own actions collapse on him. He knew he had made the right choice, but that didn't make it any less painful. After an uncomfortable silence, he finally said, "I need to go. This is what's best for both of us." He started to walk away, but Sarah stood there, not knowing what to do. All she wanted at that moment was to disappear, to escape that cruel reality that was crumbling around her. When Robert disappeared from sight, Sarah fell to her knees on the park floor, sobbing uncontrollably. What once seemed like a forbidden and exciting dream had now turned into a nightmare. She knew things would never be the same again, and for the first time, she felt like she was completely alone. Meanwhile, David was at home, anxiously awaiting news. He knew Robert would do the right thing, but that didn't ease his worry. He just wanted it all to be over, for his daughter to be able to move on and for their lives to go back to normal. But he underestimated the emotional toll that relationship had taken on Sarah. That night, Sarah didn't come home right away. She wandered around the city, lost in her own thoughts, trying to process everything that had happened. When she finally got home, her eyes were red and swollen, but she didn't say a word to David. He went straight up to his room and locked the door. David noticed the heavy silence that enveloped the house, but decided to give his daughter space, believing that, over time, she would understand that this was what was best for her. Little did he know that Sarah's silence was a harbinger of something much darker. On the morning of March 25, 2017, the Thompson home was eerily quiet. David noticed Sarah's absence in the kitchen during breakfast, but thought she was still sleeping. He didn't want to pressure her after everything that had happened. However, as the hours passed and Sarah remained locked in her room, David began to worry. He went upstairs and knocked on his daughter's bedroom door. "Sarah?" he called, in a soft voice. "Is everything okay in there?" No response. He tried again, but the silence persisted. A chill ran down his spine. Something was wrong. He tried to open the door, but it was locked. His heart started to race. David knocked on the door harder, desperation beginning to take over his voice. "Sarah, please answer me. Open the door." Still no response. He could no longer hold back his panic. He ran downstairs, grabbed a spare key, and came back, trying to unlock the door with shaking hands. When he finally managed to open it, the scene he encountered made his world stop. Sarah was lying on the bed, her skin pale and lifeless. Next to her was an empty pill bottle and a handwritten letter. David ran to her, desperate, shaking his daughter, but she didn't respond. Her screams echoed through the house, and tears ran down his face as he tried, in vain, to wake her up. "No, no, no," he screamed, his despair overflowing. "Sarah, please wake up. Don't do this to me." He tried to perform resuscitation maneuvers, but deep down he knew it was too late. His heart was shattered. Everything he tried to do to protect his daughter had tragically failed. David stood next to Sarah, sobbing uncontrollably, as the weight of reality fell on him like a ton of bricks. The letter, written in shaky letters, was on the bed. David hesitated before picking her up, but he knew he needed to understand what had been going through his daughter's mind in her final moments. "Father, I know you were trying to protect me. I know that everything you did was because you loved me, but you don't understand what Robert meant to me. He was more than a teacher, more than an older man. He made me feel alive, important, like I was more than just an 18-year-old girl lost in a world full of expectations. When you found out, my world fell apart. I knew everything was wrong, but part of me couldn't accept it. Now that it's all over, I feel like I have nothing left. He left me, and now, I'm alone. I don't know who I am without him anymore. I'm sorry about everything, Dad. I know you wanted the best for me, but I can't take this pain anymore. I love you, but I can't continue living without something I've already lost. Sarah." David read the letter over and over, unable to believe what was before his eyes. He loved her, but he had never understood the depth of Sarah's feelings for Robert. For him, it should never have been more than a youthful confusion, something that would pass with time. But for Sarah, it was everything, and now, she had been consumed by it. David called 911, his voice shaking as he explained what had happened. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived, along with the police, but it was too late. What they found was a devastated father, kneeling beside his dead daughter, holding her hand, unable to let go. While the authorities did their job, David found himself spiraling into guilt. He thought he had done the right thing, confronting Robert and protecting his daughter, but he never considered what that action could do inside her. He just wanted to get her away from a dangerous situation, but instead, she was pushed into the abyss. Days later, the small town of Bridgeport was in shock from the tragedy. Sarah's name was in all the local newspapers, and the school made a posthumous tribute in her memory. Robert Mitchell was immediately suspended, and an investigation was opened into the teacher's conduct. He was removed from his position and later charged with professional misconduct and inappropriate involvement with a minor. His career and personal life were in ruins. But for David, none of that mattered. His daughter was gone, and nothing would bring her back. Guilt and sadness consumed him. He asked himself every day what he could have done differently. If he had listened more, understood Sarah's feelings more, Would things have ended differently? That question kept echoing in his mind, an unanswered question, as he tried to piece together what was left of his life. Sarah was dead, and the painful truth was that nothing could change that. Thus ended a story that began as a forbidden secret and ended in tragedy. A relationship that should never have happened left permanent scars on everyone involved. And in the small town of Bridgeport, Sarah Thompson's name and the case that scarred her family would long be remembered as a painful reminder that sometimes even the most well-intentioned intentions can lead to dire, irreversible consequences.